In 1982, Chris and Tim decided to start their own company. Having worked maintenance for arcade games for years, the Stamper Brothers now wanted to strike out on their own. So it was that they founded Ashby Computers and Graphics Limited in the town of Ashby-de-la-Zouch in their native England. The idea was to work like mad and produce not only high-quality games, but a high quantity of them. Their platform of choice was the Sinclair ZX Spectrum home computer system, a powerful machine popular in the UK at the time. And while this was their starting point, in their time, the brothers would go through multiple genres, systems, and companies, always changing directions, but sticking to their signature excellence at the same time. And while the going wasn't always easy, along the way, they and their teams crafted some of the most memorable, inventive, and groundbreaking games of all time. It's a story not so much unique as it is rare. For their first game ever, Chris acted as designer while Tim handled the code. The game was Jetpack, a fairly basic 2D shooter in which an astronaut must fend off aliens while waiting for his rocket ship to fuel up so he can escape into another level of aliens. Still, the game ran smoothly and its simple gameplay was addicting. Plus, the jetpack was pretty cool. When they released it in 1983, however, they figured that their company name, Ashby Computers and Graphics, wasn't exactly thrilling. So instead, they invented the brand name Ultimate Play the Game to put on the boxes. They were self-publishing, which meant that they had to physically copy all the discs and ship them to stores, which required a massive investment for two young brothers. They went deeply into debt. If their game didn't sell, the Stamper Boys would be in serious trouble. Fortunately for them, their hard work paid off. Jetpack sold 300,000 units for a total of £1.8 million. Not bad change for two guys to split. They used their earnings to make more games, which in turn pulled in their own profits. Titles like Trans Am, Saberwolf, and the Jetpack sequel Lunar Jetman all released in the following years. And as each one became a hit, the Ultimate label quickly solidified itself as a hot property. However, no matter how popular the studio became, the people working there were practically invisible. Neither the brothers nor anyone from their growing team attended conferences and only rarely gave interviews. For whatever reason, the brothers liked secrecy and made it into a company policy. Combined with their success, it added an aura of mystery to the studio, the magic black box from which great games came. From what little information did sneak out, it seemed like Ashby Computers and Graphics was a pretty rough place to work. Supposedly, the employees were working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. They did take Christmas mornings off, though. What a vacation. For what it was worth, the brothers themselves worked every bit as hard as their team, so at least they were leading by example. Still, time was money, and all the hours led to solid gold. Under their Ultimate label, the studio continued to crank out hit after hit in rapid succession. In 1984, they released the groundbreaking Nightlore, one of the very first isometric 3D games of all time. The animation technique that they used, which they called Filmation, helped popularize the look of isometric 3D, which would go on to become a common visual style. While it was the third game in the Saberwolf series, Tim Stamper would later claim that Nightlore and its revolutionary graphics were actually completed before the original Saberwolf. They had chosen to hang on to it for a while because audiences weren't ready for the leap. So, by the mid-80s, only a few short years after they'd started, the Stamper Brothers owned the biggest development studio in the UK. So it was a shock to the local gaming industry when they chose to throw it all away. A short time earlier, they'd gotten their hands on a Japanese import, a dedicated video game system called the Famicom from a company called Nintendo. Chris and Tim quickly realized that this was the future of video games. Also, Nintendo had plans to release the console worldwide, whereas the Spectrum computer was mostly limited to the UK. The brothers were already a national powerhouse, but if they wanted to be a global powerhouse, this was their ticket. Without asking anybody's permission, the Stampers decided to figure out how to program for the new console. They proceeded without any documentation whatsoever. It was up to them to decode the hardware just by their own engineering prowess. To do so, they set up a subdivision within Ashby and called it Rare. Nintendo had proudly declared that their console, unlike the rival Atari platform, could not be reverse engineered. Oblivious to this, the Stampers in their Rare division did exactly that. So it was that in 1985 they sold the immensely profitable Ultimate label to rival studio US Gold, which was actually a British developer. The brothers knew that the Spectrum's time was over and ditched their Spectrum development house before it took them down with it. Their peers called them crazy for leaving a proven enterprise, but the brothers were convinced they knew where the future was going. In the meantime, they took their tech demos and flew to Nintendo's headquarters in Japan to show off what they'd accomplished. The Nintendo executives were stunned. 2 guys from England had hacked their unhackable machine, and more than that, they had made great tech demos, and they'd already ran their own successful company, and they had come to them on their own initiative? Nintendo had never seen that level of ambition, talent, and bravado seek them out before. It led to an unprecedented deal. The brothers would get a practically unlimited budget from Nintendo itself, provided that all their games were for the new console. It was everything the Stampers could have ever asked for. Now all they needed was a new company. Along with their friend Joel Hochberg, Chris and Tim Stamper officially founded Rare Limited. One would think that being rare automatically made you limited, but never mind. The newly minted Rare quickly got to work, and over the next 5 years made 44 games for Nintendo's console, called the Nintendo Entertainment System in the West, and its handheld cousin, the Game Boy. These included licensed titles like A Nightmare on Elm Street and ports like Sid Meier's Pirates. They also found time to make some original titles, such as Battletoads. Some of their old franchises like Jetman also saw new entrants, although not by the Stamper brothers. Rather, these were done by the Pickford brothers over at their studio Zippo Games. The 2 sets of brothers worked together often, and eventually, Rare acquired Zippo. Almost immediately afterwards, the Pickford brothers quit. While Rare was just as secretive as the Stampers' old company, stories like this helped paint a picture of harsh working conditions. The insane hours hadn't let up, and the Stampers could be very uncaring when canceling projects. But unlike in the Ultimate days, the crazy work ethic wasn't translating into quality anymore. It certainly meant quantity. With all the cash from their games, they'd even found time to release a few onto the Sega Genesis. But none of them blew audiences away like Jetpack and Nightlore had. The Stampers were finally on a global stage, but they were just another player. Nothing special. It wasn't a necessarily bad position, and it was still profitable. But the Stampers didn't want to be also-rans. They wanted to get out ahead of the pack and make the games that everyone else wished they could make. So when Nintendo unveiled the NES successor, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the Stampers decided to scale back the number of projects they worked on at a time so that they could invest in the new console. And this time, they didn't want to just do what everybody else did. They wanted to create the next revolution in graphics technology, something so astounding that jaws would drop worldwide. They did it with a couple of monkeys and their bananas. During the 1980s, the Stamper brothers created a successful studio in their native England. Focusing on the popular Sinclair ZX Spectrum platform, Chris and Tim made a number of great games that made their Ultimate label healthy profits. The adventure game Nightlore was one of the first to ever use isometric 3D graphics and is considered the one that helped popularize the look. But for all that, they decided to sell the company and start a new one. While everybody else called them crazy, the Stampers believed that the Spectrum platform was fading out and that a new, dedicated console from Japanese company Nintendo was the future. Impressing Nintendo's executives with their engineering skills and entrepreneurial spirit, the Stamper brothers secured unlimited funding from Nintendo to make games. But while this made them commercially successful, again, they stopped being the critical darlings they'd once been. Licensed titles and ports made them look like they were cashing in for easy money. So when the time came to create a game for Nintendo's new system, the Super Nintendo, they decided to show the world why they were still the best in the business. The Super Nintendo was a more powerful system than its predecessor, which allowed for better graphics. However, developers only used this to make higher resolution 2D sprites than before. The Stampers knew that technology had advanced to the point when wildly more sophisticated models could be used, but nobody else was trying. And so, with all the profits from their many NES games, they invested in the future of gaming. They bought ultra-high-end silicon graphics computers to make full 3D models in motion. While this looked great, the Super Nintendo couldn't render high-quality models like that in real time. The solution that Rare found seemed obvious in hindsight, but at the time was mind-blowing. Instead of having the Super Nintendo render all the graphics in real time, Rare would just render out all the models and all their movements with the silicon graphics computers. They then simply moved these pre-rendered graphics onto an SNES cartridge. The result was a game that looked like a 3D experience a generation ahead of its time. To show off the power of this method, Rare whipped up a tech demo of a boxing game. When Rare showed this off to Nintendo's executives, they literally could not believe it. They actually thought Rare must be hiding a high-end computer under the table, because there was no way a Super Nintendo could run those graphics. When they finally convinced themselves that Rare was for real, Nintendo was ecstatic. They more than just signed off on the idea, they purchased a 49% stake in Rare. This formally turned Rare into a second-party developer, meaning that while they were still technically independent, they could only make games for Nintendo. No more Genesis titles. From now on, Rare was the Nintendo of the West. Now that this was the case, the Japanese powerhouse allowed Rare to pick from a number of their lesser franchises. Of all of them, the British developer chose Donkey Kong. Kong hadn't been seen in over 10 years, but once upon a time, he'd been the star of the game that introduced Mario to the world and kickstarted Nintendo's rise to the top. Now Rare wanted to see if it could recapture the magic and do it with graphics nobody else had even dreamed of. But they'd be doing it with a different name. After their partial acquisition by Nintendo, the company became Rareware. So it was that in November 1994, Donkey Kong Country released for the Super Nintendo from the freshly renamed Rareware. And just as the studio knew it would, the game bowled over audiences and critics alike with their seemingly impossible visuals. But Rareware had taken it all one step further by complementing their 3D models with fantastic art design. The whole game had a personality all its own, right down to the tiniest details, making for a fun and vibrant world that appealed to almost everybody. The story was as simple as it was brilliant. It was the epic quest of a monkey trying to get back his bananas. And it was varied too, from the lush jungles to dark caverns to hidden temples. As soon as they looked, gamers were hooked. The gameplay itself was a sort of high-octane Mario. Rareware specifically designed the levels so that an experienced player could barrel through without ever coming to a stop. Everything was meant to be done at top speed. A number of different animal mounts helped mix up the experience. Also, since Donkey Kong and his sidekick Diddy Kong occupied the screen at the same time, 2 players could enjoy the adventure together. Or a single player could switch between the 2 different characters depending on how he wanted to get through the level. Altogether, the game offered a good amount of variety that nevertheless remained tightly focused. Despite great gameplay and unparalleled graphics, Donkey Kong Country still had a lot to compete with on its release. By 1994, the Super Nintendo was reaching old age. Newer, more powerful systems like the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn were just around the corner. Sales of the console and games exclusively for it fell steadily in the coming months and years, and caused great titles like Super Metroid to fall by the wayside. But Donkey Kong Country defied the trends by selling a staggering 9 million units worldwide. Even though it came at the end of its console's life, it became the second best-selling game on the system. Rareware had returned to their former glory, and then some. Donkey Kong Country begat an entire franchise, including Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest, and Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. Rareware also went on to create the Donkey Kong Land series for the Game Boy, a very similar franchise customized for their portable system. There was even an animated kids' TV show. While none of them quite rivaled the original's stratospheric success, the franchise became one of Nintendo's most iconic and recognizable. It became so big that even Nintendo's golden goose, Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto, felt pressure from his bosses to make his games more like Rareware's. Amazing. It was all part of the Stamper Brothers' decision to change their priorities. Instead of making tons of so-so games, now they would only produce a small number of great games. The Donkey Kong Country and Land games proved the model, but Rareware had more interest than just kiddie fare. Indeed, the arcade fighting game Killer Instinct had released just before Donkey Kong in October 1994, and it was most definitely not child's play. It was as bloody and intense as its rival Mortal Kombat series, though most gamers proclaimed that Killer Instinct had the better gameplay. It too featured top-notch graphics, although unlike Donkey Kong, it didn't have to fit them onto weak hardware. Rather, Rareware custom-designed the arcade machine to be running 64-bit, outdoing even the popular PlayStation, a 32-bit machine. As everyone knew, Nintendo was planning to skip the 32-bit generation entirely and come out with a 64-bit system before anybody else. Killer Instinct promised to release on that system when it launched in 1995. Only problem was, the new console didn't launch in 1995. Turns out, skipping a generation was hard work, and Nintendo's engineers needed more time to make the system. So when Rareware ported their popular arcade game over to console, they had to go with the existing 16-bit Super Nintendo. The result was, to put it mildly, underwhelming. The beautifully rendered models were chopped all the way down to chunky sprites with low frame rates. Still, while the graphics clearly hadn't survived the journey into gamers' homes, its well-built fighting mechanics had. Despite the downgrade, it still managed to sell 3 million units. Killer Instinct 2 broke into arcades in 1996 and was widely seen as an improvement over the original. And fortunately, a 64-bit Nintendo console did release that year, appropriately named the Nintendo 64. However, when the sequel came to the N64 as Killer Instinct Gold, it still managed to be a graphical downgrade. The console just wasn't as powerful as Rareware's custom-built arcades. Once again, the game still attracted a devoted following based on its solid gameplay, but it wasn't enough to save the series. Killer Instinct never saw another title. Still, Rareware had moved on to the new console and was excited by the possibilities that the new horsepower could afford. In February 1997, they released Blast Corps, about robot bulldozers smashing down buildings so that a runaway truck with a nuke on board wouldn't hit anything. It derived from Chris Stamper's fervent belief that, quote, if you knock down buildings, it will be fun. While an innovative concept that impressed critics, it simply didn't catch on. It wasn't a flop, selling close to 1 million units, but for a company that had grown used to making multi-million hits, it wasn't enough. By this time, Rareware had a number of teams working on different Nintendo 64 games, the biggest of which was a huge, colorful platformer very much in the vein of the legendary Mario 64. But that game ended up taking a little longer than expected, and so Rareware had to fall back on its other, smaller games in the meantime. The least exciting of these was a movie tie-in for a movie that was already 2 years old. Worse, it was being made by a bunch of first-timers. That project was almost certainly destined for disaster. The game was GoldenEye. By the late 90s, British developer Rareware was one of Nintendo's most treasured assets. After creating a slew of games for the original NES, their output on the Super Nintendo had been fewer in number, but better in nature. Games like the legendary platformer Donkey Kong Country and the respected fighter Killer Instinct put Rareware at the head of its class. Their use of pre-rendered graphics on the Super Nintendo was groundbreaking and ushered in the era of 3D modeling in video games. So when Nintendo unveiled their new system, the Nintendo 64, the studio saw it as an opportunity to push boundaries once again and explore the possibilities of open environments. Sadly, their first attempt, the bulldozing game Blast Corps, wasn't the success they hoped it would be. And the showcase title they were working on, a family-friendly platformer, ended up being delayed longer than they thought. In the meantime, all they had to release were a couple of their side projects, lesser games with lower prospects. Little did they know that one of these would become one of the most iconic, recognizable, and sea-changing titles of its generation. In 1995, the first new James Bond film in years was released. Called GoldenEye and starring Pierce Brosnan, it was seen by many as a return to form for a franchise in need of a rebirth. As a part of the multimedia blitz around the film, the video game rights for it were licensed to Nintendo, an odd choice considering the Japanese company's reputation as the kiddie-friendly company. Indeed, Nintendo was specifically trying to prove that it could appeal to the adult hardcore gamer as well. To that end, they gave the license to their Western darling, Rareware. The British studio had always showed good taste, and besides, Bond was British too. Plus, shooters were more of a Western genre. Still, the license came with an inherent stigma. Movie tie-ins were notorious for low quality. In general, they were cheaply produced and made at the last minute, released alongside the film well before it was ready. As such, Rareware didn't want to throw its weight behind a project that might not be any good. Still, one of the Killer Instinct programmers, Martin Hollis, asked to be given the project. He wanted to prove himself. It would be his first time as a game director. For 8 of the other people he brought on board, it would be their first time making a game ever. That being said, Rareware's executives, the Stamper Brothers, didn't want to release a crummy product. So they told their inexperienced team to take the time they needed to make it good, even if it meant that the film would release before the tie-in. Initially, the executives figured they'd make a side-scrolling 2D game for the Super Nintendo. However, with the Nintendo 64 right around the corner, Hollis made the bold decision to reimagine the game for the new platform. This would mean delaying the release until well after the film came out in November 1995. It would also make it a much more technically complex project. Fortunately for them, none of them knew how hard it would be, so they optimistically set off to make a 3D shooter. To keep it easy on themselves, they originally wanted to make it an on-rails game, much like arcade shooters like Virtua Cop. At some point, however, they chose to give the player freedom of movement. This would put the game in line with hardcore 3D shooters like the PC game Quake. Trouble was, serious first-person shooters were only on the PC. They had never worked before on consoles. The precision of a mouse just couldn't be replicated on a simple D-pad. However, the Nintendo 64 came with an analog stick, which the team figured could be used for greater accuracy. Another advantage of the PC platform was that the developers could just make whatever they wanted. By contrast, a console was a specific system, and any game for it had to conform to those physical limitations. When Rareware began GoldenEye, they weren't even sure yet what the system specs would be. They had to write their code and design their game based on what they thought the Nintendo 64 would be, and then change it all once the final specs were announced. You might think that with all the technical complexities, the team would want to play it safe when it came to gameplay design. Instead, the team decided to rewrite the first-person shooter. Of course, just by putting it on a console, they were being different. On top of this, they came up with a crazy idea. What if each part of the body was treated separately? For instance, what if a gun did more damage if it shot somebody in the head as opposed to the arm or whatever else? This concept was unheard of at the time. Previously, a gun simply did a set amount of damage to a target. Now, accuracy and precision would be rewarded, ironically enough, on a console and not the more precise PC. Additionally, Rareware wanted their campaign to be more than just walk into a room and kill everyone. They wanted to reward careful and stealthy players, and so included a guard detection system. The more shots a player fired, the more guards would be alerted. If players could be sneaky and pick off guards in one shot, they could get through with barely any resistance. Also, mission objectives would emphasize sabotage and information gathering, and not just mindless slaughter. And as if that wasn't enough, they kept one leftover from the game's on-rail shooter days. The player would have to reload. No FPS had done this before. Only on-rails games like Virtua Cop forced a player to reload. GoldenEye would be the first. Unbelievably, it all came together into a great package that truly felt original and satisfying. This inexperienced team had somehow crafted a gorgeous, complex action game with fantastic mission design and innovative features. They were almost ready to release. And then, at the last second, just to round out the feature set a little, programmer Steve Ellis threw in 4-player split-screen multiplayer. But who was interested in that? As a loving tribute to Bond's past, they added the ability to play as Sean Connery, Roger Moore, and Timothy Dalton, as well as Pierce Brosnan in the multiplayer. Sadly, the powers that be asked them not to include anyone but Brosnan. GoldenEye 007 released for the Nintendo 64 in August 1997, 2 years since the film GoldenEye had left theaters, and only 4 months before the next Bond movie, Tomorrow Never Dies. It was a first-person shooter on consoles. It was made by a bunch of first-timers. It was a hardcore game on a Nintendo. And so, like everybody figured, the month after launch, the game didn't sell that well. But it kept selling. Month after month, sales just didn't drop. Where most games sold most of their units in the first few months, GoldenEye kept chugging along years after it first released. Despite all the points against it, once gamers actually tried the game, they immediately told all their friends they had to check it out. Astonishingly, while the campaign was well received, that wasn't what kept gamers up all night. It was the last-minute addition, the multiplayer, that had them calling their friends over. It was fast-paced and furious, but completely accessible. A wide variety of different game modes and guns kept it all fresh for months on end. The game that had aimed for hardcore gamers hit them right in the head. And indeed, the headshot has gone on to become synonymous with first-person shooters, as has the concept of reloading. In time, GoldenEye would come to be seen as the game that began the FPS genre's migration from PC to console, which in itself makes it one of the most influential games in the industry. By the end of its run, the slow-starting movie tie-in sold a phenomenal 8 million units. It was the best-selling Nintendo 64 game in the United States. Not bad for a couple of guys on their first game. Of course, as GoldenEye sold over the years, Rareware was also releasing their other games. November 1997 saw the launch of another of their small titles, Diddy Kong Racing. While clearly a Mario Kart clone, many critics considered it an improvement on the genre and its best entrant so far. This was impressive because when the team had begun, they were making a caveman RTS, so it changed a little in development. They decided to make it a racer instead, and call it Pro-Am 64 after their long-dormant Pro-Am franchise. Late into the process, no less than Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto told them to make it a Diddy Kong game. While the guys rejected this notion at first, they eventually got on board, and Diddy Kong Racing became reality. While it had some familiar characters like Diddy Kong, it also had a number of original characters. It also had a squirrel named Conker and a bear named Banjo. Rareware was giving their audience a taste of things to come. But not everything was going well. The insane hours and tough working conditions that Rareware had become famous for were finally taking their toll. In 1997, a large group of employees quit en masse, a public sign of protest against the Stamper Brothers. It was a devastating blow and another taste of things to come. The ex-employees banded together to form Eighth Wonder, which produced exactly 0 games before shutting down a few years later. Meanwhile, after numerous delays and employee defections, Rareware was putting the finishing touches on the game they wanted to define their Nintendo 64 experience, the one that the Bond and Diddy games had just been opening acts for. In June 1998, Banjo-Kazooie finally released. It had gone through quite a few changes, originally called Dream and starring a boy named Edison and his animal friends. However, Edison was eventually replaced by his bear friend Banjo. Over time, the bird friend Kazooie also became more important until they became the title characters. In terms of genre and personality, Banjo-Kazooie was a return to the Donkey Kong style, but bringing it all into the third dimension. Like Diddy Kong Racing, it too had an obvious Mario predecessor, in this case, Super Mario 64. And also like the racer, the platformer was considered by many to be an improvement on the genre, and the best entrant in it to date. Once again, Rareware's quality shined through to the tiniest details. From vibrant colors, to wonderful music, to fluid animations, to the varied world, everything about Banjo-Kazooie was a joy to behold. The story was pretty basic, involving Banjo's quest to save his sister from the evil witch, but told with that same sense of humor and childish wonder that made Donkey Kong such a hit. And of course, the Rareware reputation didn't hurt anything. Banjo-Kazooie went on to be a hit, and in time became one of the company's signature games. The sequel, Banjo-Tooie, was released a few years later, with critics generally citing it as an improvement on what was already the best platformer around. If there was a flaw to be found, it was that Banjo didn't bring anything dramatically new to the table, unlike the redefining GoldenEye. But with such a high level of polish, nobody really minded. Going into 1999, Rareware was still on top of the world. GoldenEye was still selling for the hardcore crowd, and Banjo-Kazooie was great for casual fans. But as it happened, the next few years would see their employee problems get much worse, while their days at Nintendo came to an end. As the 90s came to a close, British developer Rareware was one of the most high-profile studios in the world. For years, they'd been generating hits for their part-time owners, Nintendo. Then, out of left field, they produced the movie tie-in GoldenEye. Made by a bunch of first-timers, the title was supposed to be a minor release and a low performer. Instead, it became one of the Nintendo 64's signature games, and a landmark achievement in the history of the shooter genre. This was closely followed by Banjo-Kazooie, a family-friendly adventure that also obtained a loyal following. As the new millennium dawned, everything seemed to be rolling right along. But as it turned out, the next few years would see the end of Rareware's golden age. After GoldenEye's unexpected success, the next game from the team was highly anticipated. It would of course be another shooter on the Nintendo 64, but this time it wouldn't be constrained by somebody else's movie. Rather, this would be Rareware's own original IP, in which they could do anything they felt like. Game director Martin Hollis wanted to push the boundaries of lighting in games by making light and darkness central gameplay mechanics. From this concept came the name Perfect Dark. But not everything on Dark was perfect. 14 months into the project, Hollis left Rareware behind. The only public statement on this came from Hollis, who said he and the company were each, quote, asking for more than the other could give. Still, the split didn't spill any bad blood, since Rareware co-founder Chris Stamper then recommended Hollis to Nintendo of America. Hollis would go on to help design their next console, the GameCube. However, his departure from Rareware had set off an avalanche effect. Not long after, two other GoldenEye veterans, David Doak and Steve Ellis, left Rareware as well. They would go on to form Free Radical Design, which later made the Time Splitters series. With the team lead suddenly missing, the game, appropriately, went dark for a while. It wouldn't be heard from again for years. But Rareware always had multiple projects going on at once, and Perfect Dark's woes didn't affect the other teams. In October 1999, Jet Force Gemini released for the Nintendo 64. The game was an action shooter that combined open-world exploration with platforming and combat. It gave the players the ability to switch between first and third person on the fly, which allowed them to seamlessly move between the shooting and the platforming. And true to Rareware's reputation, the different worlds were huge and beautiful and wonderfully varied. The story involved our heroic astronauts trying to save helpless tribals from invading alien insects. Rescuing these tribals became the central tenet of the experience. However, the game would only save players progress once they had found every single tribal in an area. Since the game also featured quite a bit of backtracking through old levels, many thought that Rareware was just doing whatever they could to extend the game time. The controls, too, were broadly considered to be clunky and unresponsive. In the end, Jet Force Gemini never reached the heights of Banjo-Kazooie or GoldenEye, its two most obvious influences. Still, as with practically every Rareware title, it did gain its own devoted following. Only 2 months later, Rareware also swung Donkey Kong 64 onto shelves. The game proudly brought the ape that had made the studio's reputation into a 3D open environment. In fact, it was so big that it was the first game to require the N64 Memory Expansion Pack, which they wisely bundled with the game. The pack added 4 entire megabytes to the system's available RAM, which was a 100% increase. The result was a platformer that had more content in it than any other game on the system. As with Jet Force Gemini, it revolved around collecting important items. Along the way, Kong and his friends would fight bad guys and solve puzzles. As gamers had come to expect, DK64 had a variety of levels and environments to explore. It also contained a number of mini-games that mixed up the standard platforming experience, everything from navigating a maze to riding a minecart. It even had multiplayer somewhat akin to GoldenEye. While it didn't do anything wildly different from Banjo-Kazooie, it just had more of it. More levels, more acres, more minigames, more environments, and more characters. The graphics, however, weren't mind-blowing, even with the memory expansion. They were top of the line, but they didn't push any boundaries. This late into the N64's life cycle, there just wasn't much more the system could physically do. Still, the tight controls and endless variety made for another solid game from Rareware. Meanwhile, the Perfect Dark game was nearing completion, with a new direction under a new team. The light and dark mechanics had been effectively removed. So instead of shooting light bulbs to sneak through a level under cover of darkness, now the players would pretty much blast through the levels, very much in the vein of GoldenEye. Still, being like GoldenEye could hardly be considered a bad thing. It released in May 2000 to fantastic hype. The story was a little out there, involving corporate super spy Joanna Dark and her adventures fighting against and alongside aliens to defeat another corporation. Still, the crazy story was wrapped around the same controls and mechanics that had made GoldenEye such a monster. Critics generally loved it, citing especially its deep customization options and fantastic multiplayer suite. It was the kind of game that players could come back to for months to come. But for all that hype and praise, when all was said and done, Perfect Dark only sold a quarter what GoldenEye had. To be fair, that was still a solid 2 million units, and obviously GoldenEye had James Bond's good name to piggyback off of. Also, the Nintendo 64 was reaching old age, and a game released exclusively for it faced an uphill battle against shinier titles for newer systems. Still, most observers had expected Joanna Dark to sell a lot closer to 007. In the end, despite the glowing praise, it was hard not to look at Perfect Dark as a disappointment. Worse, after Perfect Dark was completed, yet another mass resignation hit the studio. As per usual, no reason was ever publicly disclosed, but by now it looked like the Stamper Brothers had lost control. Once the two most respected studio owners in Britain, Chris and Tim now looked like they might be running their own company into the ground. Of course, the brothers stuck to their famous secrecy and didn't say a word. Rareware pressed on. March 2001 saw a cute, fuzzy animal platformer. Another one. As a point of fact, the team behind Conker's Bad Fur Day had struggled to stand apart for a while. There was nothing particularly different in their game from Banjo-Kazooie or Donkey Kong 64. So the team made the daring decision to make a cute, fuzzy animal game for adults instead of kids. To that end, they went for broke. Conker became the most foul-mouthed, disgusting, hard-drinking, womanizing, all-around terrible, cute, fuzzy animal imaginable. And it didn't shy away from toilet jokes. Certainly, this differentiated the squirrel from the bear and the monkey. It also aggressively went against Nintendo's family-friendly image, which even GoldenEye had never tarnished. The hope was that by producing something so wild and unexpected, Conker would make a big splash on the marketplace. After all, what else out there even came close? Sadly, the plan backfired. Nintendo liked their image just as it was, and so did not promote the game much. Despite some genuinely positive reviews which praised the game's solid mechanics, Conker failed to gain much word of mouth. And on top of that, Conker was rated M for mature, making the age of its audience 17 and above. And apparently, the 17-plus crowd wasn't interested by fuzzy animals and toilet humor. It all ended up as the single biggest flop in Rareware's storied career, selling a pathetic 55,000 units in a month. It was a sad way to close out Rareware's involvement with the Nintendo 64. But with Nintendo's new console, the GameCube, on the horizon, the time had come to move on. Their first game for it didn't come out until September 2002, Star Fox Adventures. It had actually been another N64 game at first, an original IP called Dinosaur Planet. It was about a planet with dinosaurs. However, when an early build of the game crossed Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto's desk, he had an idea. The GameCube didn't have a game yet for one of his franchises, Star Fox. Seeing the similarities between his franchise's style and that of Dinosaur Planet, he pushed to have the game reskinned as a Star Fox game, and revamped for the new console. And so it was. But when gamers finally got their hands on Star Fox Adventures, they found that it didn't play anything like Star Fox games of old. Where the earlier titles were legendary space combat games, Adventures was a ground-based, open-world experience. Like other Rareware games, it had a great amount of variety and tight controls. Like other Rareware games, it had players running around different environments looking for items. And like other Rareware games, critics praised it for its top-to-bottom quality and fine level of polish. Despite the somewhat derivative design, Rareware had done it again. As it turned out, for the last time. After Nintendo had acquired a 49% stake in Rareware, the studio had done nothing but deliver solid gold in the form of groundbreaking and system-defining games. But now, with development costs on the rise, the developer wanted additional capital. Nintendo didn't want to give it. A software company in Redmond did. The games of Rareware are some of the most beloved in Nintendo's legendary library. Donkey Kong Country brought 3D models into the video game world forever, well before anyone else in the industry was thinking about it. GoldenEye stands as the finest movie tie-in game in history and redefined the first-person shooter forever. Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64 were some of the best open-world platformers of their time. Going into the new millennium, the British developers seemed on top of the world. But despite appearances, Rareware needed more money. Even with their past successes, development costs were rising dramatically, and the studio's owners, the Stamper Brothers, were looking to sell. The result would bring to an end one of the greatest runs in Nintendo's history and change Rare's direction forever. Nintendo owned a 49% stake in Rareware but hadn't shown any interest in purchasing the remaining shares. Very quietly, and sticking to their famous secrecy, the Stamper Brothers began looking at other potential buyers. In the early 2000s, two main candidates emerged: publishing giant Activision and wealthy newcomer Microsoft. While Microsoft was trying hard to acquire great developers for its new Xbox platform, Activision initially made the better deal. It helped that Activision could publish games for all platforms, something Rareware hadn't been able to do with Nintendo. Microsoft would just make them another platform exclusive. Microsoft had all but resigned themselves to losing the bid, when suddenly, the Activision deal fell apart. The reasons for this have never been made public, but Microsoft pounced on the opportunity. However, there was still another hurdle to cross. Once Microsoft made a formal offer, Nintendo legally had a right to buy Rareware for the same price. Knowing this, and being one of the richest companies on Earth, Microsoft simply made an offer so huge that even Nintendo balked. $377 million. With that, both Nintendo's 49% stake and the Stamper Brothers' 51% stake all went to the Redmond Giant, for a grand total of 100% all for Microsoft. The software maker crowed that this was a huge boost for the Xbox, and more great games like GoldenEye would soon be coming from the British studio. And in the process, they'd be going back to their old name. Once again, Rareware would be just Rare. The deal was formally completed in September 2002. Up to this point, Rare had sold an astonishing 90 million games altogether. Of course, they would have to part ways with some of their beloved franchises, since Nintendo owned many of those characters. Accordingly, Rare's current project, Donkey Kong Racing, never saw the light of day. In a pleasant surprise, however, Nintendo allowed all of Rare's own IPs, such as Banjo-Kazooie, to go with them to Microsoft. And so, with more money and a new console, the newly minted Rare set off to work. The first game of their new era was grabbed by the Ghoulies in 2003, a lighthearted beat-em-up with a cartoony art style. True to Rare's youth-oriented games, Ghoulies featured a pretty simple premise. Young lad Cooper must rescue his girlfriend from the haunted mansion. The gameplay, too, was pretty basic: move Cooper with the left stick and attack with the right stick. In order to throw in some difficulty, Rare put in a rule for each level. For example, don't kill a certain kind of monster. Breaking any rule would summon the Grim Reaper, who would immediately kill Cooper if he touched him. Sadly, the Grim Reaper became the figurehead of Ghoulies' problems. The mechanic ended up being more frustrating than fun, as did the gameplay in general. The fact that the combat was controlled by one stick made it feel shallow and boring. Most critics saw the game as simply too simple for its own good. And while it had its moments, Grabbed by the Ghoulies was mostly ignored by audiences. In hindsight, it is generally looked on as one of Rare's worst games. Not a good start for their new console. Oddly enough, over the next few years, Rare made a number of portable games. Only problem was, Microsoft had no portable system. So Rare convinced their new bosses that if they were going to make these games, they should release them on the most popular portable around. It just so happened that this was the Game Boy Advance, which was made by their old bosses at Nintendo. Amazingly, Microsoft agreed, and Rare would make a number of small games over the next few years, such as Saberwolf and Banjo Pilot. In 2005, they went out on a limb and unleashed the truly bizarre It's Mr. Pants. Originally meant to be a puzzle game starring Donkey Kong, the game needed a new hero after Rare lost the DK rights. Mr. Pants, meanwhile, had become Rare's accidental mascot. He'd been drawn in 30 seconds flat as something to show on their website's new survey page. Never meant to be a star, the drawing was so utterly strange that Rare fans took to it. And so it was, he got his own game, called It's Mr. Pants. Also in 2005, a new Rare game came to the Xbox, which was actually an old Rare game. Conker Live and Reloaded had the exact same single-player campaign as Conker's Bad Fur Day, but added Xbox Live multiplayer. The thinking was that the original Conker was a great game that had simply been a victim of circumstance, ending up as the studio's biggest flop. Now on a new and adult-friendly console with online multiplayer, the game's genius should be recognized and Conker should finally be a success. They weren't. Conker flopped miserably for a second time. Players just didn't like drunk squirrels. To be fair, just like the first game, Live and Reloaded released at the end of its console's life cycle. Just a few months later, the Xbox 360 would release. And for that release in November 2005, Rare would have not one, but 2 games ready. They had only made 2 games for the first Xbox's entire life. Now they'd be releasing that many on day 1 for the Xbox 360. As it happened, both of these titles had originally been in production for the Nintendo GameCube, but had been shelved after the sale. The first was a part of an earlier series, and the second an all-new experience. Perfect Dark Zero was a prequel to the studio's N64 game, and once again featured freelance super spy Joanna Dark traveling the world shooting bad guys. In true Rare fashion, it featured a wide variety of environments, tight gameplay, and a barely there story. It didn't particularly push any boundaries from where the original game had gone, but certainly the Xbox 360's superior hardware allowed for much better visuals at a decent frame rate. Critics broadly praised the game and generally predicted that it would be the shooter game to beat at the console's launch. It wasn't. Seemingly out of nowhere, Infinity Ward's Call of Duty 2 utterly destroyed its competition. Even though the first game in the series hadn't been on consoles, it was by far the best-selling Xbox 360 game in the console's first month on the market. Perfect Dark Zero only sold an estimated 60% of what the World War shooter had, and as time went on, that gap only got wider. Despite all the hype, the game ended up being the last of the Perfect Dark franchise. Selling even less was Rare's other launch title, Kameo Elements of Power. A colorful open-world adventure, the game clearly took its cues from Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64. Much like those titles, the gameplay largely revolved around gathering certain items in order to progress. At the same time, it featured its own distinct art style that was widely praised as one of its standout features. In addition, the main character, Kameo, could change into any one of a number of animal forms, each having their own abilities. While adding variety, these new forms also allowed the player to advance into previously inaccessible areas. Players found their time split between combat, exploration, and puzzle solving. Unfortunately, there wasn't much time to split. For such an epic-feeling adventure, it was over surprisingly fast. Without any multiplayer to extend the replay value, most gamers chose to give it a pass. All in all, the launch of the Xbox 360 was something of an embarrassment for Rare and Microsoft. Microsoft had spent nearly $400 million acquiring the British developer, and so far, had only gotten underperformers in return. For Rare, their reputation for making trend-setting titles was being challenged. GoldenEye and Banjo-Kazooie were a long time past. Even Perfect Dark, a critical darling, simply wasn't gaining any traction with modern audiences. But Rare seized their good name back with a game that combined their signature personality, color, and wild ideas. Viva Pinata hit the store shelves in November 2006, a wildly innovative title about gardening. But somehow, Rare managed to make it an addicting and involving experience in which players could not only grow crops, but attract colorful pinata creatures. Over time, players could attract an entire colony of pinatas that would then start breeding the next generation. And that was pretty much it. No combat, no intense action, no assassinations. Just pinatas. It was absolutely nuts, and critics agreed it was Rare's best game in years. Wild. The game generated a lot of buzz for its sheer originality and quality. It gained enough attention to get its own animated TV show, the second time a Rare game had done so. Unfortunately for all that attention, Viva Pinata did not end up selling very well. November 2006 also saw the release of another Microsoft-published title, Gears of War from Epic Games. The publisher had thrown all its marketing muscle behind the big action shooter. Apparently, gray tones were more marketable than colors. Clearly, things had changed. Rare was no longer the juggernaut they'd been in the Nintendo era, and Microsoft's focus had shifted to other developers. So it was that in January 2007, almost immediately after the Viva Pinata fiasco, the Stamper brothers left Rare behind. Sticking to their famous secrecy, the brothers didn't say why, although Microsoft said they wanted to, quote, pursue other interests. It's possible that they were simply ready to move on. Either way, the two driving forces that had led Rare for 20 years were now gone. But that didn't slow the company down any. 2008 was an incredibly busy year for the company. First up was something no one saw coming: Xbox avatars, cartoonish sprites tied to each individual Xbox account. The hope was that this would give some personality and identity to the Xbox experience. Of course, the avatars came 2 years after the similar Miis on the Nintendo Wii, and many simply saw them as a knockoff. As a matter of fact, however, Rare had been working on the idea in secret even before Nintendo unveiled their Miis. The competition simply gave Rare's bosses at Microsoft a reason to greenlight the idea. The avatars became a central part of Microsoft's major dashboard redesign for the year, entitled the new Xbox Experience. That year saw a Viva Pinata sequel, Trouble in Paradise, and the first new Banjo-Kazooie game in years, Nuts and Bolts. The Pinata game was essentially an updated and expanded version of the original, while the new Banjo game put the emphasis on building custom vehicles. It made Nuts and Bolts a very different kind of game, less of a platformer and more of a construction kit. While Pinata was highly praised, Banjo received mixed reviews. Some loved the construction mechanics, while others missed the platforming. Whatever their strengths, however, November 2008 also saw another Gears of War, and once again, Microsoft put most of their muscle behind the chainsaws. Neither Rare game sold very well. It all led to Microsoft's February 2009 announcement that it was restructuring the studio. By this time, it had been estimated that all of Rare's games from Microsoft combined had earned about $100 million, only about a quarter of what Microsoft had paid to acquire them in the first place. Something had to give. So it was that Redmond ordered Rare to drop work on a number of its current projects and focus on their brand new device codenamed Project Natal. Natal was a motion-controlled system that would read players' movements and voice, no controller required. Rare would be Natal's flagship developer. Fan reaction wasn't positive, to say the least. The Natal was looked upon as a kiddie toy and not a hardcore gaming device. To many, it seemed like a fall from grace. The moment that the studio had brought GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, and Banjo-Kazooie to the world ceased to be the company they'd once been. Of course, another way of looking at it is that Microsoft could have picked any developer they wanted to spearhead their new device. Of all of them, they picked Rare for their consistent excellence and quality. Their first game for the new system, now renamed the Kinect, released alongside it in November 2010, Kinect Sports. Much like its obvious influence rivaled Nintendo's Wii Sports, the game featured a number of different sports games in a vibrant and cartoony world. And of course, Rare's own avatars were the star of the show. It was one of the signature games of the launch, and by April 2011, it had sold 3 million units. This made it Rare's biggest commercial success since the Microsoft buyout, and proved beyond a doubt the Kinect's selling power. Going forward, Rare's new studio head, Scott Henson, has promised that the company is now entirely focused on the Kinect. Kinect Sports Season 2 will release in late October 2011, developed with some help from Big Park, another Microsoft-owned studio. Even without the Stamper Brothers, they are still as secretive as ever. Nobody knows what else they might be working on, although rumor has it that they're developing a brand new hardcore mature game for the successor to the Xbox 360. Regardless, Rare has nothing left to prove. In their storied career, they have developed games for 5 generations of consoles, brought 3D graphics into the gaming world, redefined the first-person shooter, crafted some of the most enduring platformers of all time, and helped rewrite how players interact with their games. There is no one else quite like them, and that's what makes them Rare.